What if I told you that the Roman Senate were absolutely terrified of gladiators? What really kept senators awake at night was a gang of ripped dudes with sharp swords and killer abs. Gladiators weren't just ancient sport stars, they were political time bombs in simple cloth underpants. Gladiators, not just fighters or crowd pleasers, were essentially a walking uprising. They weren't your average legionnaires with tidy marching formations and dress codes. Gladiators were sharpened like blades and masters of close quarters combat, taught to kill, not just efficiently, but dramatically. And the Roman Senate had to live with such homegrown professional killers. It's not too hard to understand how they felt about that. I mean, imagine living next to a guy who trains daily to kill people with flair, and your only skill is passing laws. Differently from savage barbarians outside of Roman borders, gladiators were homegrown killers. Romans themselves produced such dangerous warriors in their own professional gladiator schools. You'd think gladiator schools were like rough gyms. Wrong. They were more like state-sanctioned MMA fight clubs. The gladiators were branded, chained, and fed a high-carb diet to build mass. Training meant hours of weapon drills, sparring with real danger, and enduring punishments for even minor disobedience. There were no days off. Every day was leg day. Gladiators trained with a kaleidoscope of weapons: tridents, nets, curved swords, heavy shields, daggers, spiked gloves. Some even fought blindfolded for entertainment. They were expected to read an opponent in seconds, adapt instantly, and look fabulous doing it. Their pain tolerance was through the roof. There's also the fact that they were denied the most basic privileges. Gladiators couldn't vote, own property, or even control their own fates. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or rebels. People society had already chewed up and spat out. But in the arena, under the roar of the crowd and the blinding Roman sun, something strange happened. They mattered. Some gladiators became overnight celebrities, ancient influencers, if you will. Their names were carved into tavern walls like bathroom graffiti. People gossiped about their love lives. Kids traded stories of their best kills. Women swooned over them like gladiator groupies, writing love notes and sending, let's just say, very forward fan mail. A few lucky ones made serious coin. Others were granted their ludus, the wooden sword of freedom, and a rare handful lived long enough to become instructors, owners, or even landlords. In a society where your birth defined your fate, that kind of social mobility was about as natural as an elephant in a toga. This is what freaked out the Roman elite. Rome ran on rules. Class hierarchies, tradition, bloodlines. Senators loved their flowcharts, but gladiators chucked the whole thing in the Tiber. They were the chaotic exception to every Roman ideal. Picture a society obsessed with control, suddenly idolizing a bunch of illiterate murderers. It was like Wall Street handing out promotions to street magicians because the crowd loved their coin tricks. Gladiators weren't just dangerous with weapons, they were dangerous with meaning. They represented the terrifying idea that greatness could rise from the gutter. They were a loophole in the system, living proof that public admiration didn't need noble birth or Senate approval, just guts, grit, and a few well-placed stabs. Of course, gladiators didn't stir the revolution with speeches. They stirred it with blood on sand, but that made them even scarier. The Senate could argue with philosophers. They couldn't debate a guy who snapped femurs for a living. They were both charismatic and dangerous. Denied power their whole life, the only way they could get it was by sheer brute force and public adoration. That is why the Senate feared gladiators. The Senate had words. Gladiators had presence. And presence doesn't need a speech. It needs a roar. And if you think the Senate's fear was abstract, theoretical, let me introduce you to the Senate's actual worst-case scenario, Spartacus. If you've heard one gladiator's name, it's probably Spartacus. And if you think the Senate lost their minds over him, you'd be right. This guy didn't just escape a gladiator school. He raised an army, like an actual army. Picture this. A ragtag group of runaway slaves and fighters turning into a 100,000-strong militia, defeating Roman legions like it's amateur hour. The Senate went from, "What's a Spartacus?" to, "Oh no, he's walking toward Rome." Spartacus wasn't just a good fighter. He was a strategist, a charismatic leader, the kind of guy who could walk into a gladiator barracks and walk out with a rebellion. He united people who had no reason to believe in anything anymore. That was his real power. It wasn't just swords, it was hope. And nothing freaks out a Roman senator more than hopeful slaves. They preferred their oppressed masses like their wine. Quiet, cheap, and not staging an uprising. For over 2 years, he outmaneuvered and outfought professional Roman armies. This wasn't supposed to happen. Rome didn't lose to slaves. They were normally undefeated, but they did lose over and over again. Eventually, the Senate had enough and sent in Crassus, one of their finest generals, with an overwhelming force and a no-mercy policy, basically the ancient Roman version of, "We tried nothing, and we're all out of ideas." Crassus was successful, but when Spartacus died, and he died like a legend, they couldn't relax. The rebellion had shaken them to their boots. Rome crucified over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way as a warning, but the message it sent was double-edged. Yes, the rebellion would be crushed, but it could happen again and again. After Spartacus, every gladiator wasn't just a fighter, they were a symbol, a spark. And that made them far more dangerous than any foreign invader. Eventually, the Senate was so paranoid of gladiators that they had to rein things in. They closed down gladiator schools and cut the performances. But here's the ironic twist. The more the Senate feared gladiators, the more the people loved them. Gladiators weren't just celebrities, they were folk heroes, the ancient Roman version of rags to riches. People didn't just watch gladiators, they worshipped them. Kids collected figurines. Ladies wrote fan letters. Grown men debated their stats, like fantasy league nerds. It was a whole thing. And the Senate watched in horror as the mob cheered for these blood-stained underdogs instead of noble generals or stern old politicians. Gladiators could sway public opinion with a single flex. That was dangerous. Because in Rome, politics was theater, and suddenly the crowd was giving standing ovations to the wrong cast. The more gladiators the public loved, the more the Senate clutched its pearls. Because what happens when a slave-turned-showstopper has more influence than a lawmaker? You get fear, not fear of swords, fear of irrelevance. And in a city built on image, prestige, and honor, that kind of fear cuts deeper than any blade in the arena. So far, we have seen that the gladiator threat was permanent and real, making senators almost quiver. But gladiators weren't just muscle, they were political pawns, too. Living, sweating, sword-swinging political statements. In the hands of Rome's power-hungry elite, they were more than entertainment. They were walking billboards for status and intimidation. Sometimes, influential senators would throw parties just to watch gladiator fighting. This was no longer just a flex. But is this not just politics? What has this to do with the Senate's fear of gladiators? Simple. In ancient Rome, everything was politics. Senators' lives were political theaters where such displays were not only appreciated, but were necessary. Some aristocrats began stockpiling gladiators, like luxury sports cars, not just for show, but for insurance. You never knew when you'd need an impromptu riot to convince a rival senator to change his vote, or at least shut up. Gladiators were muscle for hire, and their loyalty wasn't to the Republic, it was to whoever paid best, shouted loudest, or promised the most wine after. They weren't bound by military codes or patriotism. They were like ancient mercenaries with six-packs and serious anger issues. The Senate was terrified, and rightfully so. Gladiators were wild cards, freelancers. They answered to no command chain, had no fixed agenda, just bloodlust and a paycheck. For politicians who thrived on structure, decorum, and 15-hour debates about olive tariffs, this was too much chaos. One sudden brawl in the forum could derail months of carefully plotted legislation. A senator could be mid-speech, passionately arguing for tax reform, only to be interrupted by two shirtless men grappling in the dirt outside, drawing a bigger crowd than he ever could. How can Cicero compete with a guy doing backflips while dual-wielding daggers? It wasn't just about losing control, it was about losing the audience. Rome loved a spectacle, and gladiators were spectacle incarnate. The Senate feared that these fighters could become a kind of alternative power base, a populist, muscle-bound counter-government. Bread and circuses might keep the masses docile, but bread and gladiators, that was a potential coup in the making. There were even whispers, paranoid or not, that some gladiators were trained not just for the arena, but for urban warfare. Think alley ambushes, crowd manipulation, targeted beatdowns. If it sounds like something out of a mafia movie, you're not far off. Swap out the pinstripe suits and Tommy guns for leather sandals and short swords, and you've got the Roman version of The Godfather. Senators feared that Rome's politics were being hijacked by spectacle, and that the lines between entertainment and enforcement were getting dangerously blurry. And perhaps the most terrifying part is that the people loved it. The mob might cheer louder for a gladiator than for a general returning from a foreign war. That kind of charisma could topple regimes, or at least humiliate one during a heated debate. So yes, the Roman Senate feared barbarians, but barbarians were far away, swinging axes in the forests of Germania. Gladiators? They were in the streets, in the stands, and sometimes in the back row of the Senate itself. Armed, adored, and just a wink away from turning a political disagreement into a very personal bloodbath. So while the Senate outwardly feared invading barbarians, what really made them sweat were the abs, arms, and adoration of gladiators. Because gladiators weren't just fighters, they were icons of defiance, reminders that the elite's power wasn't as secure as it seemed. Turns out, nothing's scarier to a senator than someone the people love more than them. Thanks for watching, and subscribe.